How great are you, Yah? How great is your mercy? How great are the things you have done for me? How great are you, Yah? Your loving kindness is filling my heart as I sing. How great are you, Yah? How great is your love?
6 days before Yahshua's Passover. This will be session 1. Examine me, O Yahuwah, and prove me. Try my reins and my heart. We are here today, and what a blessing it is on this beautiful day here in Northwest Montana on the Sabbath, and a high Sabbath because it is the first day of unleavened bread. We're grateful to make this presentation today and provide the information about the 6 days that occurred before Yahshua's Passover in 30 CE. And this will be session 1 of a two-session presentation. Our Father, we thank you for this day. Your name is holy, and your way is holy. We look to your kingdom coming, and your will be done. And these holy days proclaim your plan of salvation. Thank you for calling us out of the world. We pray that you'll provide for us and give us our daily bread, physically and spiritually. May we be fed spiritually today on this double Shabbat. We honor you. We seek you. Pray that you'll keep us away from the world and the world's way and the tempter. We look forward to your kingdom coming as this day is a part of your plan of salvation. Thank you for the day. We ask your blessing now and your guidance during this afternoon's presentation. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Well, greetings to all. The Passover day was yesterday. Today is the first day of unleavened bread. What a delight it is to be into the holy day season. It was about 2.5 months ago, my wife and I were standing outside in the middle of winter and said, you know, if Passover is in the early month this year, it's only about 2.5 months away. And boy, that time has just flown by. And here we are. We're at the date during the days of unleavened bread. Today, we're going to be looking at the 6 days before Yeshua's Passover. It's labeled as part 4 in an ongoing series. There's a series of presentations that has to do with the Passover, going back to part 1, which talked about our redemption by faith and how it was 430 years to the very day when the Israelites left Egypt. And then we looked at the second part, which was the Exodus from Egypt itself, a view in part 3 of the historical Passovers. And now we're here today to talk about the Passover of Yeshua, particularly the 6 days before the Passover. And this will be in 2 sessions. The last time I did this presentation, it was a single session, but some new material has been added. And it's been pretty exciting to prepare for this. So this will be session number 1. And as I've said a number of times in the past, understanding Yahuwah's plan of salvation by looking into these holy days is something that really unfolds the true meaning. Yahuwah's holy days show us his plan of salvation. Until you really understand that and honor his holy days and keep them, it's pretty hard to understand the bigger picture of salvation that these days bring forth. It's somewhat of a misnomer to call the spring holy days the spring holy days and the fall holy days fall, because they're biblically or scripturally there's really summer and winter. But in our vernacular, the days that we're honoring now happen in the springtime, usually in March or April, and so we label them the spring holy days. And these were largely fulfilled during Yeshua's first coming. The first fruits of The agrarian society took place in this period of time. The barley harvest was the first of the first, and actually the flax that went along in the same period of time. And then some 50 days later, as we get to Pentecost, the wheat harvest was what took place. And then we wait throughout the entire summer season to get to the fall, and the fall holy days generally will be fulfilled at Yeshua's second coming, although we can look forward to that and understand a lot about his second coming from studying them. So the bottom line is the spring holy days, those which we are honoring now, the first and last day of unleavened bread, preceded by the Passover on the 14th of Abib, looked forward to Yeshua's first coming, which has been complete, and the fall holy days will look forward to his second coming. Now, the purpose and meaning of these holy days was something I went into in the early presentation about getting ready for Passover, preparing yourself. And we went into some depth on the meaning of the Passover and the meaning of the first and last day of unleavened bread. We will just rehearse that briefly here as a reminder that the Passover and the Passover season, frankly, is all about redemption. And the Passover, in Hebrew, the word that's used in the scriptures is Pasach. It means omission or exemption. And the Israelites were exempted from the death angel on the Passover, the first Passover that was outlined in Exodus chapter 12. And part of the topology of the Passover is that we are redeemed, the Israelites were redeemed, and we are redeemed by a perfect lamb. That redemption now is through Messiah. And one of the scriptures that I've used in the past for this is Ephesians chapter 1, in whom we have redemption, or the ransom paid in full through his blood, through forgiveness of sin, according to the riches of his grace, wherein he has abounded toward us in all wisdom and prudence, having made known unto us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he has purposed in himself. Yes, that mystery of his will is unfolded in these holy days. It's really amazing to see the mystery that unfolds when you examine the holy days. So we have redemption through Messiah. So this Pasach day itself is all about redemption. And then the first day of unleavened bread, which is where we are today, is about deliverance and liberty. And the Israelites were liberated from Egypt, and as we have gone previously into the accounts in Exodus 12, 13, and 14. But now we are delivered by Yeshua. And in Galatians chapter 1, it says that grace be to you and peace from Yahuwah the Father and from our Master Yeshua Messiah, who gave himself for our sins, that he might deliver us from this present evil world. Tear us out, select us, and release us from this present evil world, according to the will of Yahuwah and our Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. Our Father, glory goes to you. So this day is all about this deliverance and this liberty that we now have through Yeshua. And we're going to focus on Yeshua specifically today and the events that transpired just before his final Passover dinner and his crucifixion. And then the last day of unleavened bread coming up, which will be on our calendar this year, next Friday, will be about hope and salvation. And as the Israelites realized their hope and salvation by being taken through the Red Sea, our hope, of course, is through Yeshua. And in Romans chapter 5, it says, therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with Yahuwah through our Master, Yeshua Messiah. What a hope that is. We're justified by faith because we believe in him, by whom also we have access by faith unto this grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of Yahuwah. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation works patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. So that'll be coming up in a week on next, as the calendar in the Gregorian system goes, next Friday. We're on the Sabbath day, first day of unleavened bread right now. So we're going to start this presentation talking about the 6 days before Yeshua's Passover with a little bit of background, and you will notice that my presentation of these events may be different than your understanding of the presentation of events. And there's been many people that have researched this topic of when was the actual date of the crucifixion. Was it 28 or 30 or 31 or 33 CE? And there's been lots of good work done by some fine people to research this topic, as well as what day of the week did this occur on. And by going into a little bit of the specifics of this, in no way should it detract from the significance of what Yeshua has done. So by talking about the calendar alternatives, I have no intention of saying this is what is most important. It's of interest, and when you look into it, it unfolds more about Yeshua and Yahuwah. So I wanted to take a look at it a number of years back and look at the calendar alternatives. And we'll briefly examine which calendar was in effect during this period of time. So people that have studied the calendar know that there's probably two main alternatives. The calculated Hebrew calendar, which the Jews use today in Judaism, is a calendar that's based on the dark presence of the moon, and they call that the molad and the new moon. There also is an alternative to that, which is the first visible crescent, and which calendar was in effect back in this period of time. So we'll look at the calendar considerations and what year actually did the crucifixion take place. And again, many people, many good scholars have looked at this and drawn their own conclusions, and there's lots of good evidence that people use to justify a particular year. I wanted to look for myself, and the conclusions that I came up with were somewhat different than probably the mainstream understanding of this. And then which day of the week is it? There's really three main theories as to which day of the week was the Passover and the subsequent day following first day of unleavened bread. So we will look at that briefly. And then we're going to go into the main body of the presentation, which are the 6 days before the Passover. It's somewhat of a chronological timeline, and you can stitch it together largely with the account in Mark chapter 11 through 14 or so, and we'll get to that, but we'll take a look at a chronological view of this. And in the process, we're going to uncover something today that's been really fascinating for me to see in the scriptures, and whether you agree with it or not is up to your study and your relationship with Yahuwah. But who was Lazarus, and who were Mary and Martha, and this location of Bethany, how does it figure in, and Bethphage, how does it figure into these 6 days, and is there any topology or meaning into some of these accounts that mention these names? So we're going to look at that, or at least we're going to start to look at it today, and we will conclude it next week in session 2. So first thing I want to bring out is the calendar alternatives. Now, a number of years back, I wrote a paper, a study research paper on this subject titled "The Most Important Date in History," and you can find that on my website and under in-depth studies. And it's a detailed look at these calendar alternatives, what day of the week, what year, and how do you come to understand, or do you just pick a year and think that's when it happened? I've done a substantial amount of research into this and looked at all the alternatives, and I was actually surprised at the outcome. I didn't seek the outcome that I ultimately found. It was actually surprising that it came that way. But in looking at the calendar alternatives for when was the Passover, the year that Yeshua was crucified, you find there are three theories that are prevalent in the believing community. Theory one is held by largely the churches of God, particularly the Seventh-day churches of God, and they hold to the understanding and the theory that the Passover was on a Wednesday. And the subsequent day, of course, the first day of unleavened bread would have been a Thursday, and Friday would have been a non-holy day, but then the Saturday would have been the Sabbath day. So also theory one presupposes that Yeshua was in the grave exactly 72 hours. So Matthew 12:40 is one of the anchors that they use. In fact, and frankly, it's the only, Matthew 12:40 is the only anchor that says, it says that Yeshua would be in the belly, be in the earth as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights. The theory one proponents say that means exactly 72 hours. So consequently, Yeshua was crucified on that Wednesday, Abib 14th, put into the grave Wednesday going into Thursday at sunset, exactly 72 hours as the weekly Sabbath was making the transition to the first day of the week on Sunday. He was resurrected exactly 72 hours later. So that's the supposition for theory one, and it's held by a wide range of groups, particularly those that have the worldwide Church of God heritage. I'm going to jump to theory three because if you examine the paper that I wrote on this, the most important date in history, I've labeled these three theories in the same order, so I didn't want to take them in a different order to confuse anybody that might want to take a look at the paper. In any case, theory three is by far what the largest group of people believe. Mainstream Christianity understands and believes theory three, and theory three says that the Passover was on Friday, the year of the crucifixion, and that 2 days and 2 nights later, Yeshua was resurrected Sunday morning at about dawn. And the scripture in Matthew 12:40 is not used in the backup for theory three. Theory three people advocate that the 3 days and 3 nights was simply an allegorical count. So this would be your hermeneutical view would be that when something says 3 days and 3 nights, that it was really meant as an allegory. And so Friday was the day of the Passover. Sabbath, Saturday was the first day of unleavened bread, also the weekly Sabbath, and then Yeshua was resurrected. So that's theory three. And again, by far the largest body of mainstream Christianity holds to this particular theory. Theory two is in the middle between theory one and theory three. And again, when I researched this, I didn't think theory two was an option. And it just is one of those things you discover when you go look. And theory two says that the Passover was actually on a Thursday, and that the first day of unleavened bread was Friday, and that yes, Yeshua was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, but it wasn't exactly 72 hours. And the 3 days and 3 nights are made up of the components starting Thursday afternoon is 1 day. So even though he was in the grave, an hour or a number of minutes before sunset on that particular Thursday, that day counted as one. So 3 days and 3 nights literally fits into this equation by using the remnant of Thursday counted as day one. So I hold to theory two. You may hold to one of the other theory options, but I'm going to give a little bit of the background and explanation of why I've concluded this, as well as the year we'll talk about the actual year that this happened. So bear with me as I go through somewhat of a detailed chart. So the crucifixion date in year and year has a lot of controversy about it. So, and you have to be interested in calendar topics in order to really sort through all of that. And what this chart shows you that I've put together here is the main years that people promote of when the actual crucifixion took place. You don't find, I don't think you find anybody earlier than 28 CE. So 28 CE was the starting point that I used through 33 CE. And I suppose there might be a small handful of people that think it's 34 CE, but these are the year ranges that people associate with the actual crucifixion year when Yeshua was crucified in Jerusalem. So there's a couple of parts to this chart. The first part is the two different calendar systems that could potentially have been in use at this point in time. So those that hold to the calculated Hebrew calendar, also known as the Hillel II calendar, believe, some of them believe that this calculated calendar was the method that the temple authorities used in the first century to calculate the new moon day, and then associated with the new moon day 14 days later, of course, is the Passover day. So the calculated new moon day is easy to go forwards and backwards with because it's a mathematical formula that actually Hillel the second came up with. And incidentally, he didn't come up with this and publish it at least until about the 3rd century. So it's hard to understand why anybody would think that this calendar was in effect in the 1st century, but there are those that hold to that. In any case, the calculated Hebrew calendar associated with the day 1 new moon day, when you use the algorithm for the calculated Hebrew calendar, comes up with, and it's consistent with a number of calendar calculators, so I'm comfortable and confident in these dates. So as an example, in 28 CE, if you use the calculated Hebrew calendar, day 1 of the new moon would have been on a Tuesday, March 14th. Consequently, once you know when the new moon day 1 is, you can determine when the Passover day is by the calculated Hebrew calendar. And so that first example, if the new moon day was March 14th, day 1, then the Passover day would have been on a Monday. So it's important to note the day of the week depending upon the year. So that's what I did for all of the years throughout the sequence going to 33 CE. Also, by the way, I integrated into this chart the years that had the potential to have a late barley harvest. And the barley harvest is important, particularly in the second calendar that we look at, which is the first visible crescent calendar. And I don't think there's really any standing by anybody that really gives this an honest look that this first visible crescent moon calendar was in fact what was in effect in the 1st century. You can read about it in the Mishnah, and you can read what Gamaliel, who was in charge of the calendar court, talked about in his proceedings and how they evaluated the witnesses that came in. There's a large body of evidence of this is how they were doing it in the 1st century, particularly in this time frame when Yeshua lived and walked on the earth. So in contrast to the calculated calendar, I've also added this line for when would have new moon day been if you used the first visible crescent calendar. Associated with that, you can then determine when the Passover was. And you'll just notice in our first example here that in 28 CE, the new moon day calendar is 1 day different than the calculated Hebrew calendar. Associated with Passover, 1 day different. Passover would have been on Tuesday, if you were watching the moon versus it would have been on Monday if you were using the calculated calendar. So hopefully that's of use. And I said I integrated the years that there would have been potential for a late barley. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that there are any records that show us for sure when these Passover dates were. No credible chronology or record of it that I have found. But I wanted to look at the years that the possibility existed from the first visible crescent perspective. So we have that situation, by the way, this year. It's real interesting. There are some people that hold to the barley is not ready, so therefore it's next month when Passover is, versus those people that say the barley is ready or will be ready by Wave Sheaf Day, which, by the way, will be tomorrow on this year's calendar. And so there seemed like there's plenty of barley available for Wave Sheaf Day this year. But anyway, that controversy goes on, and we won't get into that. Now, with this amount of information, we put it all together, and I show it all on one chart, and it's kind of a lot to swallow. But what's important about the chart, and the reason I originally put it together, I wanted to find out what days of the week the Passover occurred, depending upon which year you think it was. And I started out the presentation with the 3 different theory groups of Theory 1 being a Wednesday Passover, Theory 3 being a Friday Passover, and Theory 2 being a Thursday Passover. So now that I know this data here on this chart, we can apply which theory goes with what year. And what's notable about it is if you're a Theory 3 person and you hold to a Friday Passover date, you only have 1 year available when the crucifixion could have occurred, and that would have been in 33 CE. And it's notable that it doesn't matter which calendar system you use. Some years, some months, the 2 calendar systems that I'm talking about here are the same, and some months they're different. So it just depends on how the calculated calendar comes out versus when the first visible crescent really does occur. From Jerusalem is what this is all about. So if you're a Theory 3 person, 33 CE has to be the year, because that was the only year that there was a Friday Passover in this date range that I've looked at. In contrast, if you're a Theory 1 person, you have quite a number of options on this chart. And it's notable that the Thursday Theory 2 option only has 1 option, and it's an interesting one. And it, without any other evidence, the only year that there could have been a Thursday Passover is 30 CE. And without any other evidence, that's what you would conclude from this chart. And the Thursday Passover in 30 CE was dependent on the spotting of what would have been a difficult to see new moon on day 1. So those that follow watching the new moon today know that some months the new moon is easily spotted over Jerusalem, and some months it's difficult to see because it's low on the horizon and there might be clouds or fog or something or a storm. So months that the moon is low on the horizon are difficult viewing months, and those that follow the new moon today know that. And you also know, though, that sometimes those difficult months, those months that the moon is particularly low, the moon is in fact spotted. So that's why we're asked by faith to walk with Yahuwah. By faith, we look for these things. And so the only year that this is possible, and it would have been a difficult observation, but it was possible to see, was on this 30 CE on our Gregorian calendar, which would have been April 4th. And that would have been the earliest possible. So the chart was interesting from my perspective to put together to see. And that's what the data resulted in. Now, I want to talk about a few of the considerations that I've looked at least. Other people have looked at other considerations, but a few considerations of how do you determine when Yeshua was born? Because when Yeshua was born starts the clock to his crucifixion, and it's, I would say, most commonly understood that he was crucified when he was about 33 and a half years old, and that seems to follow the chronology of his ministry and so forth. So when you find out the year of his birth, you can move forward to find out the year that he was crucified. And we'll start a few of the comments about this topic with the Hasmonean dynasty that ruled some 126 years. And in the BCE time frame, 160 to 37 BCE. So a lot is known about the Hasmonean dynasty, and I'll show you the family tree, starting with Matthias back in 166 BCE. He was seen to be the father of all of this. This goes back to the time when Antiochus Epiphanes IV was pillaging the land and had taken over Jerusalem and was defiling the temple. This was the first example of the abomination of desolation, where Antiochus Epiphanes actually was sacrificing pigs in the temple, and he had suppressed the Jewish people, and the Maccabees were standing up trying to get free from this guy's reign. And Matthias was the first guy, but the guy that really overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes was his son Judas Maccabeus. He was the high priest starting in 165. It was 165, 164 when Antiochus Epiphanes was actually thrown out of Jerusalem. And the Maccabees took over the dynasty of running and ruling the temple through their own non-Cohen priesthood, by the way, which is, as this dynasty progressed in time, the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees came out the bottom of it, the religious authorities. So it went from a priestly system to a two-party system that were competing with one another by the time we get to the bottom of and the end of their rule. Now, the last guy standing here was Antigonus, and in 37 BCE, and Herod the Great had him killed. So Herod the Great enters into the picture because Herod wanted authority. He had already, by this, in 37 CE, been named a king of Rome, but he wanted to be the king of Judah, and he knew the only way he could do that would be to establish some connection to the tribe of Judah's family tree. Turns out that these are all Judahites here in this Hasmonean dynasty. And Miriam, who was the daughter of Alexander at the end of this dynasty, married Herod. I should say Herod married her. And that's how he made his connection into the Jewish community at that point in time. Herod proclaimed, after he had married Miriam, that Herod's family tree came from Persia in the time that Cyrus had released the captives that were there in 539 BCE, and Herod said his family were one of the early ones that went in to reestablish the temple and rebuild Jerusalem back in 530 BCE, along with all the other captives that Ezra and Nehemiah have listed in their documents, in their scriptures. So Herod tried to make the case that he was a part of that, and he had married Miriam. And of course, this all didn't work out so well. Herod was a pretty ruthless character. He ended up killing this wife, Miriam. And there's a lot of history that goes along with this. Perhaps it could be a presentation all of its own sometime. But Herod ruled from 37 to 4 BCE, and 4 BCE is the important part of this. How do you know it's 4 BCE? Because, and I'll show you a couple of the linkages to that. And one of them is found in Josephus. And actually, Josephus has a lot to say about this period of time. And I want to read Antiquities 17, this is section 6.4. Now, it happened that during the time of the high priesthood of this Matthias, there was another person made high priest for a single day, that very day which the Jews observe as a fast. The occasion was this. This Matthias, the high priest, on the night before the day when the fast was to be celebrated, seemed in a dream to have conversation with his wife. And because he could not officiate himself on that account, Joseph, the son of Elymas, his kinman, assisted him in the sacred office. But Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias who had raised the sedition with his companions alive. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. So you'd have to read the previous 3 or 4 sections in Antiquity 16.6 to get the fullness of this, but the summary is in this period of time there was a Matthias that came with a group of rebels and tore down an eagle that Herod had placed in front of the temple, a statue of an eagle. And of course, the priesthood and the Maccabeans in this period of time wouldn't want that. So this rebel group led by a guy named Matthias came and tore it down. That's a different Matthias than's being talked about as the priest Matthias here. And this priest Matthias that had a dream in the night about his wife and deemed himself unclean because of the dream, needed to have a substitute for the service the next day, which was service of a fast day. And that fast day points to a day of atonement, Yom Kippur. And so Herod, when he says he deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias he's talking about is the guy that helped take the eagle down. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. Now, when you go look at this, you say, well, so what? There was an eclipse of the moon. Well, it turns out in all of Josephus' writings, which are extensive, this is the only eclipse of the moon that he mentioned. So I thought that must be notable. When could this have been? And so I went out to do the research on it, and NASA has a great technical website that helps with research of solar and lunar eclipses forward and backward as far into antiquity as you want to go. And what I discovered is, and I'm not the only one that's discovered this, by the way, I've seen others that have used this data, but what I discovered is in 5 BCE, there were 2 total eclipses. And actually I looked for a range starting in 1 BCE, the -1 is BCE and the -6 is BCE. So I went from a range of -1 BCE to -6 BCE. And you can find when all the eclipses are. The P is for partial, and the T is for a total eclipse, and the N is for a penumbral eclipse, which is a kind of a pretty minor eclipse resulting from the shadow of the Earth shining on the moon rather than the full eclipse of the Earth shining on the moon. So there was only really 3 eclipses in this period of time in Jerusalem that took place that were total eclipses. There's several that were partial, and actually some of the research I've seen done on this, people like to use the partial eclipse. And the one that they pick on a lot, if you go check this out on your own, is this partial eclipse on March 13th in 4 BCE. And the reason 4 BCE is picked on is because it's, after you study this, you start to see that that's when you put all the parts and pieces together, you see that that's when Herod the Great died, was in March of 4 BCE. But we haven't gotten to the bottom line of that yet. In any case, it's notable that March 23rd and September 15th in 5 BCE, now those are both spring holy days and fall holy days, basically, and the eclipses only happen on a full moon. So it's pretty notable that there were 2 of those eclipses in that period of time. I will add to this conjecture, but I think it's interesting conjecture, because John the Baptist was born 6 months ahead of Yeshua. I might talk just a little bit more about that when we get to that page, but it's thought that John the Baptist and Yeshua were born in this particular year, and actually I think this is the year, and I'll show you why here in just a second, at least at a high level detail. Again, I've examined this in a great amount of detail. If you want to go into it in the paper I wrote that's on the website, the most important date in history. So it appears to me that this total eclipse in March was the one during the time John the Baptist was born, and the one in September was the time during when Yeshua was born. And it's not provable. I'm just saying, connecting some dotted lines together. That's the conclusion you make. So the eclipse data is useful, and I will say, if you get interested in the calendar and go look at this, if you actually go find this exact chart on this NASA website, you will see that the date ranges here are 1 year different, because, so in other words, the -6 will say -5, the -5 will say -4, and so forth. And the reason you'll see that on the NASA website is they use astronomical time, and astronomical time has a 0 year that separates BCE and CE. And I converted this to our Gregorian calendar, so we have a level playing field here, and comparing apples and apples and apples to apples. So if you go take a look at this, you will see that the actual astronomical time is 1 year different, and you have to convert it to get it to a Gregorian calendar base. The Gregorian calendar, of course, wasn't in effect at this point in time. The Julian calendar was in effect, and the calendar systems present a real challenge, because you gotta keep everything on a level playing field. So if you go start looking at this, it's real easy to get confused with what the Julian date was versus what the Gregorian date was versus what the astronomical date was. So in any case, I've taken all that into consideration and adjusted accordingly. Now, the second part of this is when Herod's death was, and Josephus wrote about that in detail, and actually Antiquities 17, if you go look it up, has a lot to say about Herod and Herod's life and what he did, and his last days and the people he had executed, and where he died, which was in Jericho. And you get a whole chronology through Josephus of Herod's life. And his last, I will say, his last 6 months were terrible. Of course, Herod was the one that called for the killing of the innocent ones, and the innocent ones, 2 years and younger, were killed because he didn't want Yeshua to become king of the Jews, because he was king of the Jews. He thought he was. So I'm going to read this this short account in Antiquities. And now Herod altered his testament upon the alteration of his mind. He was going crazy, in other words. For he appointed Antipas, to whom he had before left the kingdom, to be tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and granted the kingdom to Archelaus. When Archelaus had done these things, he died, meaning Herod died, and he died in Jericho. You see, if you read the context. The 5th day after he had caused Antipater to be slain. Now, Antipater was his first son by, not Miriam, but by a different wife whose name was Doris, having reigned since he had procured Antigonus to be slain. And if you remember, Antigonus was the guy, or the Maccabean, the last one standing that Herod had slain in that dynasty. So and he puts a time marker on this, having reigned since he had procured Antigonus to be slain 34 years. But since he had been declared king by the Romans, 37 years. So what's interesting about this is you get 2 date markers here. So if you can find out when Antigonus was slain, 34 years later is when Herod died. And if you can find out when he was named king by the Romans, 37 years later, Herod died. And that's pretty easy to go find out. And if you go do your homework, you'll find that Herod reigned those 34 years, and Antigonus died in 37 BCE. So 37 BCE minus those 34 years puts Herod's death at 4 BCE. I will mention that there's, again, calendar system details to pay attention to, and this is the detail of whether there's ascension dating or non-ascension dating. And fundamentally, the difference in non-ascension dating is that when a person starts his reign, you count year number 1 from day 1 versus an anniversary date, which is usually a new year. So that's all in play here when you go do the research on this. So Herod died in 4 BCE according to this calculation, based upon 34 years after he had Antigonus slain. You also will find that the Romans put him in power in 40 BCE. And again, the calculation remains the same. 40 minus 37 takes you to the same spot, which you would expect, which is 4 BCE. Another interesting sidelight of this are Herod's sons. When you research when they started their reign, when the Romans put them in power, you find out in all cases that his sons, particularly Antipas, who was the Herod that was in charge during Yeshua's time on the earth, reigned from 4 BCE, and Philip the Tetrarch reigned in a different location, but his reign started in 4 BCE. Of side note about Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch, the one that was involved with Yeshua's crucifixion, he lost his tetrarchy of Galilee in the 2nd year of Caligula in 39 CE, and you see that in Antiquities 18 also. And he was banished in exile to Spain, so he didn't end well, where he died the same year in 39 CE. Just a couple little facts about him. In any case, all of these markers point to Herod dying in the spring, just before Passover, incidentally, when you read through the accounts in Josephus. Herod died in 4 BCE in the spring. And of note, there are some considerations about that. And one of them is that Herod the Great was the one that put the decree in place to kill all of the babies that were born 2 years and younger. And so the killing of the innocents. And the killing of the innocents date, when he did that proclamation, isn't clear. Where it seems to fit most likely and logically is late in the year in 5 BCE. And that likelihood tells you quite a bit, though, assuming that it's a correct assumption. And that's what it is, though. It's an assumption. But it looks like late in 5 BCE is when Herod made that proclamation. Let me talk just a little bit about the birth of John the Baptizer in the springtime versus Yeshua being in the fall. If those that may have looked into John the Baptizer may know that there have been some really quite good studies looking at the time that Zacharias was the priest, because Zacharias was of the course of Abia. And you see that in Luke 1:5, and you see all about Zacharias and the situation, and he became speechless for a period of time, and so forth and so on. But when you examine all of that, and you look at the courses and when his course would have served, there's several different interesting studies that I have read myself. One of them, as it comes to my mind, is by a guy named Fred Coulter. If you want to look at that, that would be a useful bit of background on this calendar dating question. And what these studies have shown, and I have not done one myself, I've read several, and they're very actually compelling, that Zacharias, because we know when his course was serving in the temple, you can determine when his son John was born. And it all comes out, the bottom line of it is John the Baptist was born in the springtime at the holy day season, right where we are right now. And he was born in 5 BCE. You also know from that Yeshua was born 6 months later. So he would have been born in the fall of 5 BCE. And when you add to that the consideration of the killing of the innocents, there were only 2 years that were possible for Yeshua to be born, 5 BCE or 6 BCE, because the 2 years would have gone back too far and Yeshua would have been born before the killing of the innocents if you go back to 7 BCE. So there's only 2 possibilities of when Yeshua could have been born with all of this data so far, 5 or 6 BCE. And 6 BCE, if you go back to the chart of the Passover and the days of the first day of the new moon chart, you would see that in 29 CE, the Passover would have been on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, depending upon which calendar and depending upon if the new moon was visible. So 6 BCE would not have been an option. Obviously, we don't have Passover. Anybody that thinks Yeshua's Passover was on a Sunday, a Sabbath, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. So you get this narrowed down to 5 BCE with some degree, I think, of good accuracy with a few of these facts. Also, a few things to consider on top of all of that. In Luke 3, the Tiberius is mentioned. It turns out that Tiberius had a co-regency that's not mentioned in the scriptures, but Tiberius was a co-regent with Augustus. And the scripture says in Luke 3 that it was his 15th year. Most people that look into this think it's his 15th year from his sole reign, which started in 14 CE. Which you don't know unless you go look is that Tiberius actually was probably the one largely in charge because Augustus was old and sick starting in 12 CE. So the records show clearly that the Romans put Tiberius in charge in a co-regency situation starting in 12 CE. And that dates, when you add all these things together, that dates and makes Luke chapter 3 date to 26 CE. Also in Luke 3, Yeshua is about 30 years old. I'm not going to go into the details, but that puts a date on Luke 3 at 26 CE. Luke chapter 4 is an interesting chapter, particularly verses 18 and 19. It's 2 little verses where Yeshua got up in the synagogue and preached the acceptable year of Yahuwah. And he was quoting from Isaiah 61, which is a Jubilee proclamation type of chapter. That likely happened late in the summer in 27 CE. And what's interesting to look at are the sabbatical years that influenced what he would have said in Luke chapter 4. Now, again, these are the sabbatical studies. There are a couple of them on our website. And during this period of time, there are provable 7-year sabbaticals dating back to the 2nd century and dating forward to the 2nd century CE. So 2nd century BCE, the 2nd century CE. And you find when you do the research that when the years of these sabbaticals were, and if you make a list of them, you find out that here's the list. But what's notable about the list is, in fact, they are 7 years apart. So 163, and then the minus 1 to BCE 135, then the 44. If you do the math on it, you'll see that these are all continuous, maybe not 7 or 14 or 21 years. In other words, multiples of 7. So what this shows us is that the sabbatical was in fact being kept, the 7 years sabbatical, or the 49-year sabbatical cycle, was being kept during this period of time, particularly when Yeshua came with his ministry. Now you notice I left a spot open here, and the spot open happens to be this year 27 going into 28 CE, when Yeshua made this proclamation in Luke 4:18. He was proclaiming the Jubilee rest and Jubilee reset. What had happened as a result of the corruption of the temple, which started at the time of the Maccabees and continued on through this period of time until the temple was taken out in 70 CE. The scriptures and the Torah were becoming corrupted with the empty ritual and meaningless worship kinds of practices. Yeshua in 27 CE was proclaiming the Jubilee reset. They had forgotten about the 50th year of Jubilee. It happens to be exactly at the right point in time of when the Jubilee would have been, if you do your homework on this. So in any case, this scripture in Luke 4:18 has some real legs to it of what Yeshua was really doing, and when you put the calendar to it, you end up with quite a story of what was going on with the sabbatical. So that may all be more than you want to know about those subjects, but it all enters into when was Yeshua born and when was he crucified. John chapter 2 has a scripture that talks about the temple was 46 years in the building, and Yeshua said, well, in 3 days I will raise it up again. And if you go look this up, you find that Herod started his temple project in 20 BCE. 46 years later would be 27 CE. So we're getting anchors, and we're getting benchmarks of when different dates happen, and it turns out that they all interlink without any error. So on the crucifixion day, there's a couple of things I want to mention, and then we'll go on to this presentation more about what was going on 6 days before. But on the crucifixion day, 3 days later, in Luke chapter 24, Emmaus, on the road to Emmaus, there were two guys going along, Cleopas and an unnamed associate, and a third party came who was Yeshua, who had just been resurrected. And Yeshua was talking to these two guys, and Cleopas said, well, don't you know what's been going on here? And Yeshua said no, and Cleopas said, well, they were talking about the big event of the crucifixion that had just happened. And Cleopas said, well, it's been 3 days since these events. He was talking about the crucifixion. So when you read that, you might just easily gloss over it, but consider Cleopas said it's the 3rd day since these events. So and that was clearly the first day of the week, because it's in Luke chapter 24, that's how it starts. And if you back up from the 3rd day, the previous day would have been the Sabbath, which would have been the 2nd day, and the back up 1 day from that would have been Friday. What do you get to? You get to Thursday or Friday. You can't get to Wednesday. So it's impossible, if the 3rd day since the crucifixion was on Sunday, to have a Wednesday Passover and Wednesday crucifixion in a year. It doesn't make any difference what year. It's just technically not possible to count backwards, inclusively or exclusively. You get to either Thursday or Friday when you do that. And also a few notes of scriptures that talk about that Yeshua will rise from the dead the 3rd day. There are 14 witnesses in the New Testament that use that terminology, and there are additional 5 more witnesses that talk about building the temple in 3 days, or rebuilding the temple in 3 days. So I've put a bunch of dots on the wall, and I know that I haven't connected all of them. This subject is more than, just a half hour or 45 minutes worth of dialogue to understand it, but I wanted to give you some of the points of why I have concluded what I have concluded. And when I put this chart up, I have a comfort that says Thursday was the crucifixion day, and it was in 30 CE because I've done some research on it. So it's not just a random set of words. It has some depth behind it of why it is. So with all of that in mind, we're now going to get to the meat of the matter. And because keep in mind, dates are dates. Is there salvation by dates? No. The salvation is by Yeshua Messiah, because he was crucified, died, buried, and resurrected for us. And that's what the focus of this is. It's all about Yeshua. But to me, it's been fascinating to try to put a real timeline on it that is accurate. So what we're going to do here is this particular timeline chart of these days, starting at Abib 8, is going to be our anchor for the rest of this presentation, as well as the next one. And we're going to zero in on these 6 days, Abib 8 through Abib the 13th. So let's start with Abib 8. And you notice that it's on the day of the week we would call Friday. And when we get into this, there's some background that makes it useful to understand the bigger picture. And I'm going to go into that background today. So we will talk about 6 days before the Passover, Yeshua came to Bethany, and that will be our starting point. But we're also going to note that there, a guy whose name is Lazarus is there. Another guy, of course, Judas Iscariot is there, but Martha and Mary are there, and a guy named Simon. And this has all just been fascinating to unravel, to see who these people are. So we'll look at the background and see if we can stitch this picture together of the scriptures talking about these same characters in different places. So 6 days before Passover, Yeshua came to Bethany. I will start with John chapter 12, and we'll read the first few verses of it, but we will come back to it because we're going to have to digress to dissect what is being said in these first 4 verses. So Yeshua, 6 days before the Passover, he came to Bethany, where Lazarus, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. And it's of note of they sat at the table, and this word sat isn't like in a chair, it's more like to recline in company at a meal. And this apparently was the cultural pattern that they had for these kind of events, these kind of dinners, these special dinners in this period of time. And it was a cultural thing at that point. Then took Mary a pound of ointment, and that ointment is myrrh of spikenard, means it's FDA approved, it's trustworthy, it's genuine, and it was very costly, and anointed the feet of Yeshua, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment, which was the myrrh. Then said one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son. That's noteworthy. Judas Iscariot is Simon's son, which should betray him. Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? So we get the context of this, and we see the harmony account of this, a parallel account, and there are a couple of parallels in other in Mark and Luke, and we'll get to those. But there's a woman, an unidentified woman, so it's not identified as Mary, but she's identified as with an alabaster box doing the same thing in Matthew chapter 26. Now, when Yeshua was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, so now we get a little more detail here. This is Simon the leper. John calls him Lazarus. Then came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at the meal. So is this 2 different events? Well, it's the same location, same within a few days. It has to be within a few days of the same exact period of time. And Matthew says he poured it on his head, and the John account says that he anointed his feet. I would say add these scriptures together. This is one in the same account. The woman, whose name is Mary, anointed Yeshua's head. Matthew, keep in mind, was a good Hebrew boy. He was a tax collector, a publican, and his message was to the Jews of the society in that point in time. So he would have had a Levitical perspective. So pouring this precious ointment on Yeshua's head doesn't surprise me that Matthew would have it that way. That's what he observed, even though John observed it being pointed on his feet. It was all the above. The other choice you have is, I have seen some commentaries that try to make this into two separate events, and you can do that. I would be interested if you could make all the rest of the parts and pieces match up. I don't think it's the right exegesis to have it two separate events. My perspective and the study I've done on this shows me that this is one and the same. And I think you'll see why as we go through a little more of the detail. So we need to go backwards in time. So we were just at 30 CE. Now we're going to go back a couple years in time to an account that's in Luke chapter 7, which was dinner with a guy named Simon the Pharisee. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Yeshua sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, means the same thing, box of myrrh, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spoke within himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she is a sinner. And Yeshua answered and said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto you. And he said, Master, say on, go right ahead, lay it on me. There was a certain creditor, Yeshua said, which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him the most? So you may have thought of this account as unassociated, but look what there's two clues here that are obvious. One of them is a guy named Simon. So Simon was probably a pretty common name. I mean, Simon Peter was, that was Simon Peter's other name was Simon Peter. But look what we have in common here. We got a guy, it was at dinner, another guy at dinner, and his name is Simon. And a woman shows up with an alabaster box of ointment and anoints Yeshua's feet. So what's going on here? An uninvited woman comes in. Now, is she really a stranger to this household? I would conjecture that if she didn't belong there, that she would have been called out, and something would have been said that would have led you to believe that she didn't belong there. Simon didn't say anything. It's just like, oh, this woman is here. She's uninvited to our dinner, but she's coming in now. My assumption to this, and certainly it's conjecture, is that this uninvited woman actually lived there. Simon, he also said he was ashamed of her. And so why would Simon allow the woman in his house if she didn't already belong there? So sort of is the question. So I think there's some parsing out of this scripture. You have to put yourself in the situation of what was going on to say, who was the woman? And it doesn't give her name here, but it might be becoming obvious. She was a sinner, and obviously a woman of the city. I think that means she was a prostitute. And but she came and anointed Yeshua's feet. Now, going on with the account, Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom forgave the most. Remember the question, who was forgiven the most? The guy with 500 get forgiven, or guy with 50? And he said unto him, you have rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, see you this woman? I entered into your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I have come in, has ceased not to kiss my feet. My head with oil you did not anoint, but this woman has anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loves much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. And I think that's notable. That's why I've highlighted it. So what do we see here? Simon is acknowledging the woman's sins, but not his own. The homeowner would be the one that would be responsible to provide the foot washing. So Simon didn't offer it. And part of this family is this woman, and so she provides it. The woman would not provide foot washing as if she were just a walk-in guest to the house. That would have been not the social standard. The homeowner or someone living in the house or the servant of the house would provide the foot washing for somebody that would come in. And by the way, it was not unusual. I mean, they walked with sandals and it was dusty, and putting your feet through a pan of water to wash off the dirt was, as I understand it and have seen it, a common practice in these days. So this all fits that this unnamed woman was in fact Mary, who lived there with Simon. And you'll see why she would have been living there with him as we get to the conclusion of this inspection. Now, another part of this happened a couple of years later, a year and a half or two later, and it was in Luke chapter 16 that a man became known as Lazarus, and there's a parabolic type of account that includes a guy named Lazarus. And we'll take a look at that in this particular part of the presentation. As a note, Luke 16 has several parts to it. The first part of Luke 16 is about the unjust steward and those that serve two masters. The middle part about it is the idolatry of the Pharisees and the scribes and the greed of the Pharisees. And we get to the third part. It's this parable. This is all seemingly unconnected, but I think it's all connected. Luke 16 is, one subject goes to the next and they're all related. So keep in mind that the greed of the Pharisees is part of this chapter. And so when we get to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, we might start putting some of these pieces together of what's about to happen. So keep in mind, this is a parable. There was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Now, those that have watched any of my previous presentations will remember that I believe this is a direct reference to Caiaphas, the high priest. And everybody knew that this was a reference to him. Keep in mind, the Pharisees were listening to this. The disciples were there. Yeshua was talking to his disciples, but the Pharisees were overhearing all of this. They would have known who this rich man was, I'm certain. He was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. That's how Caiaphas lived. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus. And I'm guessing at this point in time, there was a guy that his name was, they called him Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, and he's full of sores. And doesn't say that Lazarus was a leper here, but he says it was full of sores. And so, what kind of a medical condition do you have when you're full of sores? Well, it was common in this time and in this culture that leprosy was a real curse. So it was likely that this guy Lazarus had leprosy, and it's being described as full of sores. And desiring to be fed with crumbs which fell from the rich man's table, moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. So the rich man, referring to Caiaphas here, and he sees Abraham afar off, but he also notices that Lazarus is in his bosom. Lazarus ended up with Yeshua, or with Yahuwah, and the rich man didn't. And he cried and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus." So whoever the certain rich man was knew that he had a father, Abraham. So this would just fall in line that this was part of the priestly succession, that they knew that they went back to Abraham. "Have mercy on me and send Lazarus." I'd like to see Lazarus now, "that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame." And he cried and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented with this flame." So keep in mind, this is a parable, but it's a parable likely with some real circumstances that were going on in this period of time. And continuing on, Yeshua says, "But Abraham said, 'Son, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and likewise Lazarus got evil things. But now he is comforted and you are tormented.'" So again, likely the Pharisees and the scribes that were listening to this, I don't believe it says the Sadducees, but it certainly does say the Pharisees in the account earlier in Luke 16. They heard this. It's hard for me not to imagine they didn't know who was being talked about here. And keep in mind, by the way, the Sadducees didn't believe in a hereafter. The Pharisees did, but that's all part of their belief system goes into this also. "And beside all this, between us and you and there is a great gulf fixed." So this gulf is so wide. If you look at this great gulf fixed in the Greek, it means such a wide chasm that it can't be breached. So in other words, you got the dead, you got the guy that did well on the wrong side of the chasm, and you got the guy that was sick and didn't do so well on the right side of the chasm. "So that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence." Then he said, "I pray you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house." So this is the rich man saying, "I pray you, Father, that you send this guy Lazarus to my father's house." Who's the father of Caiaphas? Well, his father-in-law is Annas. "For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify of them, lest they also come in this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." See if that does any good. "And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if one went in unto them from the dead, they will repent." In other words, if you raise somebody from the dead and send them in to my sons, they will see that and recognize that you are the Messiah, and they will repent. That's what it says between the lines here, if you think about it. "And he said unto him, Yeshua's talking now, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. So this is real key how this ends. Even if somebody is raised from the dead, your sons won't get it. Now backing up to here to Annas's house that's mentioned, this was a dynasty of high priests. Annas was the first of the bunch. He actually bought his way into the high priesthood, if you read about him. And he was actually ousted in 15 CE by a proconsul of Rome for a series of violations that the Romans didn't like. In any case, one of his sons was Eleazar, who only reigned for a year. Caiaphas was the son-in-law because Caiaphas married Annas's daughter. And you see that in John 18. Jonathan was also a son. That's the second son. Theophilus is the third. Matthias the fourth. And Annas ben Ananus was the fifth. So he had 5 sons that matches up perfectly with this account. And it's interesting that it's all talked about this way. Perhaps you haven't heard this perspective of it. And maybe I'm wrong. I might have this wrong. There might be another explanation, but it's compelling to me to see what's going on here. And I think the bottom line of this is that this account is setting up the conditions for Lazarus' resurrection. Keep in mind, this was a parable. And probably Lazarus was sick at this point in time, but he hadn't died. And keep in mind, this is in likely early 30 CE, late 29, early 30 CE. So we only have, a few months, 6 months or so before Yeshua is crucified. So this fits in with the account now that we jump to in John chapter 11, where there was a certain man who was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. So are these two Lazarus connected? When you go analyze this and look at a lot of commentaries, not very many commentaries say that these Lazarus are connected. I think they are. Again, I might be wrong. You have to do your own homework. And I know that there's conjecture and assumption and coincidence happening with all of this, but the scriptures are stitched together in a very interesting way. Coincidence is an interesting word, because if you think about it, is there really such a thing as a coincidence? I think the answer is no. Coincidence is when Yahuwah is working undercover and incognito. And so that's what we have here, is some number of coincidence that happened to be. So this certain man was sick named Lazarus. It was that Mary which anointed the master with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. It says in John 11. Now, there's a couple of possibilities here. John wrote this account looking in the rear view mirror. So John wrote this in 40 or 50 CE, looking backwards to this 30 CE date. And it's possible here he was referring to chapter 12 when he says it was that Mary that anointed the master with ointment and wiped his feet. It's possible he was looking forward, but I would say it's more likely he was looking to the account that we read about in Luke chapter 7 that he's referring to, because that's the unnamed woman did that same exact thing. And this guy, Simon, was not sick with leprosy yet. But it's interesting to say that it was that Mary which anointed the master with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Master, talking to Yeshua, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Yeshua heard that, he said, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of Yahuwah, that the Son of Yahuwah might be glorified thereby. Keep in mind how Luke 16 ended. It doesn't matter if I raise somebody from the dead, they still won't believe. Now, Bethany was near unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs, a couple of miles or so. And now we jump to a parallel account in Mark chapter 14. So this gets us to the days immediately before Yeshua's last Passover and the crucifixion. And it starts out, after 2 days was the feast of the Passover and of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, when you read through this, you see that the next event you could associate with it being 2 days before the feast, which would put it out of alignment as the same event that happens in John. But I suspect this is a thematic insertion that Mark is doing here. So he's given us a general chronology of the events that went on, not necessarily in chronological order. And being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at meat, there came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious. And she broke the box and poured it on his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of ointment made? We saw in the John account, the John 12 account, that it was Judas, but it might have been more of a conspiracy with more than one of the disciples that made this statement. We see this potential conspiracy in a couple of places. Why was this waste of ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence and have been given to the poor. And they murmured against her. They murmured against her. And Yahushua said, let her alone. Why trouble you her? She has wrought a good work on me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever and whensoever you will, you may do them good. But me you have not always. She has done what she could. She has come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she has done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her. That's what you're hearing right now, a memorial of this woman. And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray unto them. So here's the account in Mark, and we will come back to Mark next week for some greater details as this week proceeds. So that gets us full circle with all the background back to where I started, which was John 12. So let's read John 12 again now with some addition to it. Then Yahushua 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Yahushua and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then said one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him. So when we come full circle to this, we probably see the dots on the wall coming together. And the woman with the alabaster box in the parallel account in Matthew 26 is talked about in a little greater detail here. Now, when Yahushua was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and it's myrrh. And myrrh, one of the uses of myrrh was for those that were dead. So the woman, who is Mary, is preparing Yahushua for his death, and poured it on his head as he sat at meal. Notice the same word, sat, to recline as a corpse or at a meal. So this is a pretty far leading position this is describing when they were having this dinner. And when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, to what purpose is this waste? Notice it's the disciples mentioned here again, plural. For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. When Yahushua understood it, he said unto them, why trouble you the woman? For she has wrought a good work upon me. For you have the poor always with you, but me you have not always. For in that she has poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also that this woman has done be sold for a memorial of her. So who is Lazarus? The name Lazarus appears 15 times in the New Testament, and it's only in Luke 16 and John 11 and 12. So these are the accounts we've been focusing on, is where it is. And Luke 16 is where we saw Lazarus and the rich man. That's where it's focused on. And in John 11 and 12, it's a Lazarus resurrection, and then this dinner with Lazarus. The dots that connect for me on this is that Lazarus was reduced to a position of begging when he became leprous. And the Pharisees didn't have any sympathy for him. They regarded him as one that was condemned. Yahushua condemned him. He was a sinner, so the end result is he contracted leprosy and he was unclean. So at John 12, we see that at supper with Lazarus, who is this guy Simon, Mary anoints Yahushua. So the location in Mark 14 and John 12 are both identified as Bethany. So it's the same place. In a worse case, this is two separate events, but all of the circumstances point to it's a single event. Simon the leper in Mark 14 is identified as Lazarus in John 12. Certainly you would see that. The woman in Mark 14 is identified as Mary in John 12. The spikenard and myrrh is the same ointment used for Yeshua's head and his feet. Now in Matthew 26, we see that the account is at Bethany, at Simon the leper's house, who is Lazarus, and Mary anoints Yeshua there. Just the same, it's the same account written with Matthew's perspective, same as in John 12, 1 through 6. Simon was humbled by Yeshua's parable of the two debtors in Luke chapter 7. It goes all the way back to that original dinner, and he contracted leprosy, the end result, so that Yeshua would heal him as a testimony, the testimony of his messianic credential to the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's how Luke chapter 16 ended, that even if there was such a resurrection, you wouldn't believe it. But Luke chapter 16 was setting up for the event that was about to happen as one of the final miracles that Yeshua would perform to show them that indeed he was a Messiah. So this all points to Yeshua and his messianic credentials. Now the word leper is interesting to go parse out. We look at it in the Greek, and it's the Greek Strong's number 2976. And it's interesting because it says it's probably H499, which means Eleazar. So what Strong's has done in this case, and you have to obviously watch Strong's, because when it says probably, it might be probably yes, and it might be probably no. So they took a phonetic similarity to Lazarus and made it Eleazar. There's a phonetic similarity, and that word Eleazar means Yahuwah is helper. And there are 15 matches of it. It's always translated as Lazarus, 4 in Luke and 11 in John. Now in the Hebrew tongue, the Strong shows us that it's number 6879, and 6879 is pronounced Sarah. And it has 20 matches in the Old Testament. It says that it's a primitive root, means to scourge or to be stricken with leprosy, leper or leprous. So the word in the Hebrew, Sarah, is clear what it means. It means to be a leper, to have that skin disease. Now, since leper in Hebrew is Sarah or Zara, and the Hebrew adds an L to indicate to become, you end up with to become a leper would be translated as Latzara. And when you're translating into Greek, the suffix us or os is added. The end result is to become a leper is Lazarus. Pretty amazing. Lazarus. It's a common synonym for leper. And if you Google it and look it up and do some of your own homework on it, you will see that Lazarus has a common etymology going back to leprosy. Just amazing. Another parsing out I did was for Judas Iscariot, and looking for the derivation of this name. This one is not as clear, and as far as I've gotten with it, the word in Greek is Iskariotes. It's of Hebrew origin, probably, is what it says, means the inhabitants of Kerioth, and an epitaph of Judas the traitor. Certainly, it's an epitaph of him. It can mean to be a man that is a man in a manly way, and to show oneself a man in the Hebrew, that word H377. It also can refer to a city, and there has been a city that has been found that's identified as Kerioth or El Kiryatin, 10 miles south of Hebron. So possible that's where this connection is. It's unproven, and I've seen this conjecture in several places, that Judas' surname is a corruption from a Latin term, Sicarius, and it means murder or surrender. This is probably a good possibility here, although I can't find any direct correlation to it. It's a similar phonetic structure, suggesting Judas Iscariot would have belonged to the Sicarii, which was a Jewish radical group that were considered terrorists in this period of time. So he put all this together, and Simon Lazarus was the man who contracted leprosy. He had sisters whose names were Mary and Martha, and he had a son whose name was Judas. And that all puts the family tree pretty close together, that Mary and Martha were aunts to Judas Iscariot, and he was their nephew. So again, putting the parts and pieces together, you'll have to decide if this is how you add these dots on the wall together, but I think it's a pretty compelling story, and certainly it's an interesting one. It focuses on the messiahship and the messianic credentials that Yeshua, in this one final set of incidences, partook of and showed the Pharisees and the Sadducees that in fact he was Messiah that was predicted to come from the Old Testament law and the prophets. And now we'll just cover the next day, which is day 9, which is the Sabbath day. People come to see Yeshua. There's not much on this day in this timeline because it was the Sabbath day. And so many Jews came to be eyewitnesses of not only Yeshua, but of Lazarus, who had been known by this point in time to have been raised from the dead. This event seemed to happen in the last 6 months of Yeshua's ministry. So John 12 goes on to say, from the dinner that we just looked at and all the players of the dinner at Lazarus' house, much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, and they came not for Yeshua's sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. So plenty of opportunity to do your own homework on this, and I certainly know that there's circumstantial evidence that I've presented to you, and that you have to make up your own mind whether these things be so. And again, it's not about dates, it's not about time, it's about Yeshua. Yeshua was the one in the centerpiece intended to be focused on in this presentation, so may this all be to his glory. So, next time, which will be 7 days from now, and it'll be next Friday. We're on the weekly Sabbath today, so next Friday will be the last day of unleavened bread, and I'll take you through the 4 days now before Passover. We've covered the first 2. We've covered Abib 8 and 9. We're going to cover Abib 10 through 13. And you're going to find some pretty interesting discoveries in this section of Scripture also. We'll examine the triumphal entry and look at that in some amount of detail, how the perfect lamb was selected and how the crucifixion really was the final installment from a prototype that was shown us in Genesis 22 when Abraham and Isaac went up the mountain for Isaac's potential sacrifice. And of course, we know how that turned out, that the angel said, stop. And we're also going to look at, in a good amount of detail, it's been one of those aha moments for me, the fig incident. The fig incident happened on 2 separate mornings, on the Abib 11th on a Monday, and then the next day on Tuesday, Yeshua came back and the figs were dried up. This event happened at Bethany, and we will take a look at the background of all this and how it figures into the message that's being given here and what the figs represent. Yeshua also disrupted the temple merchandisers in this point in time. And it turns out that Tuesday, Abib 12th, was really a big full day. The most of the events in this chronological timeline happen in this one day on Tuesday. from the event of the figs drying up in the morning to the priest being engaged, and the Olivet prophecy, which happened in the afternoon, and the prophecy of his coming. Remember, the disciples said, show us, or tell us, Yeshua, when will these things be? When will be the signs of your return and your coming? So we will look at that, and that will get us to preparation for the Passover on Abib 13th. So that's what's coming up next Friday. May Yahuwah be with you during these holy days, during these days of unleavened bread. May he enrich your life, and may we all grow together in faith and knowledge. So we look forward to seeing you next time. In Yeshua's name we do pray. So thank you, our Father, Yahuwah, in heaven above. We are grateful. We honor you and ask you to bless us and guide us and sanctify us, set us aside during this holy day season, and may we be pure and clean and pure in your eyes, and may we serve you and be pleasing in your sight. Thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessing to honor you on the weekly Sabbath, as well as this first day of unleavened bread, this holy day during this Passover season. Thank you for showing us the way and the path, and we honor you and glorify your holy name. We seek your truth and your way. Would you lead us and guide us and show us now and keep us from the world and the evil one, and we honor you in Yeshua's name. Amen.
of sin is cracked again. I wanna serve you well until the end. I don't wanna be a Judas man. I don't wanna be a Judas man.
You're the only one who knows about my sorrows. You're the only one who knows all my tomorrows. You're the only one who can take my selfish living, turn it all around and change it into healing. Used to be I tried to work out all my problems, but it seemed the more I tried, the more I could not solve them. I knew that you could help me, but I guess I didn't care, 'cause I just went right on living as if you weren't there. You're the only one who knows about my sorrows. You're the only one who knows all my tomorrows. You're the only one who can take my selfish living, turn it all around and change it into giving. When the sky turns gray, he's carrying the sunshine. When the sun goes out, I can still recall the good times. It isn't things around me that can make or break my life, but how close I live to Yahushua in the day and in the night. You're the only one who knows about my sorrows, and you're the only